Oh, hello, and welcome back to Baby Alias's stories. We now return to Understood Betsy by Dorothy Canfield Fisher. Chapter 6. If you don't like conversation in a book, skip this chapter. Betsy opened the door and was greeted by her kitten, who ran to her, purring and arching her back to be stroked. "Well," said Aunt Abigail, looking up from the pan of apples in her lap, "I suppose you're starved, aren't you? Get yourself a piece of bread and butter, why don't you, and have one of these apples." As the little girl sat down by her, munching fast on this provender, she asked, "What desk did you get?"
Provender.
Provender. Provender, food, animal fodder. As the little girl sat down by her, munching fast on this provender, she asked, "What desk did you get?" Elizabeth Ann thought for a moment, cuddling Eleanor up to her face. "I think it is the third from the front row. I think it is the third from the front in the second row." She wondered why Aunt Abigail cared. "Oh, I guess that's your Uncle Henry's desk. It's the one his father had too. Are there a couple of HPs carved on it?" Betsy nodded. "His father carved the HP on the lid, so Henry had to put his inside. I remember the winter he put it there. It was the first season Mother let me wear real hoop skirts. I sat in the first seat on the third row." Betsy ate her apple more and more slowly, trying to take in what Aunt Abigail had said. Uncle Henry? And his father? Why, Moses or Alexander the Great didn't seem any further back in the mists of time to Elizabeth Ann than did Uncle Henry's father. And to think he had been a little boy right there at that desk. She stopped chewing altogether for a moment and stared into space. Although she was only 9 years old, she was feeling a little of the same rapt wonder, the same astonished sense of the reality of the people who have gone before, which make a first visit to the Roman Forum such a thrilling event for grown-ups. That very desk. After a moment, she came to herself, and finding some apples still in her mouth, went on chewing meditatively. "Aunt Abigail," she said, "how long ago was that?" "Let's see," said the old woman, peeling apples with wonderful rapidity. "I was born in 1844, and I was 6 when I first went to school. That's 66 years ago." Elizabeth Ann, like all little girls of 9, had very little notion how long 66 years might be. "Was George Washington alive then?" she asked. The wrinkles around Aunt Abigail's eyes deepened mirthfully, but she did not laugh as she answered, "No, that was long after he died, but the schoolhouse was there when he was alive." "It was?" said Betsy, staring with her teeth set deep in an apple. "Yes, indeed. It was the first house in the valley built of sawed lumber. You know, when our folks came up here, they had to build all their houses of logs to begin with." "They did?" cried Betsy, with her mouth full of apple. "Why, yes, child. What else did you suppose they had to make houses out of? They had to have something to live in right off. The sawmills came later." I didn't know anything about it, said Betsy. Tell me about it. Why, you knew, didn't you? Your Aunt Harriet must have told you about how our folks came up here from Connecticut in 1763 on horseback. Connecticut was an old settled place then compared to Vermont. There wasn't anything here but trees, bears, and wood pigeons. I've heard 'em say that the wood pigeons were so thick you could go out after dark and club 'em out of trees, just like hens roosting in a hen house. There always was cold pigeon pie in the pantry, just the way we have donuts. And they used bear grease to grease their boots and their hair. Bears were so plenty. It sounds like good eating, don't it? But of course, that was just at first. It got quite settled up before long, and by the time of the Revolution, bears were getting pretty scarce, and soon the wood pigeons were all gone. And the schoolhouse? That schoolhouse where I went today, was that built then? Elizabeth Ann found it hard to believe. Yes, it used to have a great chimney and fireplace in it. It was built long before stoves were invented, you know. Why, I thought stoves were always invented, cried Elizabeth Ann. This was the most startling and interesting conversation she had ever taken part in. Aunt Abigail laughed. Mercy, no, child. Why, I can remember when only folks that were pretty well off had stoves and real poor people still cooked over a hearth fire. I always thought it a pity they tore down the big chimney and fireplace out of the schoolhouse and put in that big ugly stove. But folks are so daft over new-fangled things. Well, anyhow, they couldn't take away the sundial and the windowsill. They couldn't take away the sundial on the windowsill. You want to be sure to look at that. It's on the sill of the middle window on the right hand as you face the teacher's desk. Sundial? Repeated Betsy. What's that? Why, to tell the time by when they didn't have a clock? Asked the child. Aunt Abigail laughed. Good gracious. There was only one clock in the valley for years and years, and that belonged to the Wardens, the rich people in the village. Everybody had sundials cut in their windowsills. There's one on the windowsill of our pantry this minute. Come on, I'll show it to you. She got up heavily with a pan of apples and trotted briskly, shaking the floor as she went over to the stove. But first, just watch me put these on to cook so you'll know how. She set the pan on the stove, poured some water from the tea kettle over the apples, and put on a cover. Now come on into the pantry. They entered a sweet-smelling, spicy little room, all white paint and shelves which were loaded with dishes and boxes and bags and pans of milk and jars of preserves. There, said Aunt Abigail, opening the window. That's not so good as the one at school. This only tells when noon is. Elizabeth Ann stupidly at the deep scratch on the windowsill. Don't you see? Said Aunt Abigail. When the shadow got to that mark, it was noon, and the rest of the time you guessed by how far it was from the mark. Let's see if I can come anywhere near it now. She looked at it hard and said, I guess it's 4:30. She glanced back into the kitchen at the clock and said, Oh, pshaw! It's 10 minutes past 5. Now, my grandmother could have told that within 5 minutes just by the place of the shadow. I declare, sometimes it seems to me that every time a new piece of machinery comes into the door, some of our wits fly out at the window. Now, I couldn't any more live without matches than I could fly, and yet they all used to get along all right before they had matches. Makes me feel foolish to think I'm not smart enough to get along if I wanted to without those little snips of pine and brimstone. Here, Betsy, take a cookie. It's against my principle to let a child leave the pantry without having a cookie. My, it does seem like living again to have a young one around to stuff. Betsy took the cookie, but went on with the conversation by exclaiming, "How could anybody get along without matches? You have to have matches." Aunt Abigail didn't answer at first. They were back in the kitchen now. She was looking at the clock again. "See here," she said. "It's time I began getting supper ready. We divided up on the work. Ann gets the dinner, and I get the supper. And everybody gets his own breakfast. Which would you rather do, help Ann with dinner or me with the supper?" Elizabeth Ann had not had the slightest idea of helping anybody with any meal, but confronted unexpectedly with the alternative offered, she made up her mind so quickly that she didn't want to help Cousin Ann and declared so loudly, "Oh, help you with the supper?" and that her promptness made her sound quite hearty and willing. "Well, that's fine," said Aunt Abigail. "We'll set the table now, but first you would better look at that applesauce. I hear it walloping away as though it was boiling too fast. Maybe you better push it back where it won't cook so fast. There are the holders on that hook." Elizabeth Ann approached the stove with the holder in her hand and horror in her heart. Nobody had ever dreamed of asking her to handle hot things. She looked around dismally at Aunt Abigail, but the old woman was standing with her back turned, doing something at the kitchen table, very gingerly. The little girl took hold of the handle of the saucepan, and very gingerly she shoved it to the back of the stove. And then she stood still a moment to admire herself. She could do that as well as anybody. "Why," said Aunt Abigail, as if remembering that Betsy had asked her a question. "Any man could strike a spark from his flint and steel that he had for his gun, and he'd keep striking it till it happened to fly out in the right direction, and you'd catch it in some fluff where it would start a smolder, and you'd blow on it till you got a little flame, and drop tiny bits of shaved up dry pine in it, and so, little by little, you build your fire up. But it must have taken forever to do that." "Oh, you didn't have to do that more than once in ever so long," said Aunt Abigail briskly. She interrupted her story to say, "Now you put the silver around while I cream the potatoes. It's in that drawer. A knife, a fork, and 2 spoons for each place. And the plates and cups are up there behind the glass doors. We're going to have hot cocoa again tonight." And as the little girl, hypnotized by the other's casual, offhand way of issuing instructions, began to fumble with the knives and forks, she went on, "Why, you'd start your fire that way, and then you'd never let it go out. Everybody that amounted to anything knew how to bank the hearth fire with ashes at night, so it would be sure to last. And the first thing in the morning, you got down on your knees and poked the ashes away very carefully till you got to the hot coals. Then you'd blow with the bellows and drop in pieces of dry pine. Don't forget the water glasses. And you'd blow gently till they flared up and the shavings caught. And there your fire would be kindled again. The napkins are in the second drawer." Betsy went on setting the table, deep in thought, reconstructing the old life. As she put the napkins around, she said, "But sometimes it must have gone out." "Yes," said Aunt Abigail, "sometimes it went out, and then one of the children was sent over to the nearest neighbor to borrow some fire. He'd take a covered iron pan fastened onto a long hickory stick and go through the woods. Everything was woods then, to the next house and wait till they had their fire going and could spare him a pan full of coals. And then don't forget the salt and pepper. He would leg it home as fast as he could streak it to get there before the coals went out. Say, Betsy, I think that applesauce is ready to be sweetened. You do it, will you? I've got my hands in the biscuit dough. The sugar's in the left-hand drawer in the kitchen cabinet. Oh, my, cried Betsy, dismayed. I don't know how to cook. Aunt Abigail laughed and put back a strand of curly white hair with the back of her floury hand. You know how to stir sugar into your cup of cocoa, don't you? But how much shall I put in? Asked Elizabeth Ann, clamoring for exact instruction so she wouldn't need to do any thinking for herself. Oh, till it tastes right, said Aunt Abigail carelessly. Fix it to suit yourself, and I guess the rest of us will like it. Take that big spoon to stir it with. Elizabeth Ann took off the lid and began stirring in sugar, teaspoonful at a time. But she soon saw that made no impression. She poured in a cupful, stirred it vigorously, and tasted it. Better, but not quite enough. She put in a tablespoonful more. She put in a tablespoonful more and tasted it, staring off into space under bended brows as she concentrated her attention on the taste. It was quite a responsibility to prepare the applesauce for a family. It was ever so good too, but maybe a little more sugar. She put in a teaspoonful and decided it was just exactly right. Done? Asked Aunt Abigail. Take it off then and pour it out in that big yellow bowl and put it on the table in front of your place. You've made it. You ought to serve it. It isn't done, is it? Asked Betsy. That isn't all you do to make applesauce? What else could you do? Asked Aunt Abigail. Well, said Elizabeth Ann, very much surprised. I didn't know it was so easy to cook. Easiest thing in the world, said Aunt Abigail gravely, with the merry wrinkles around her merry old eyes all creased up with silent fun. When Uncle Henry came in from the barn with old Shep at his heels and Cousin Ann came down from upstairs, where her sewing machine had been humming like a big bee, they were both duly impressed when told that Betsy had set the table and made the applesauce. They pronounced it very good applesauce indeed, and each sent his saucer back to the little girl for a second helping. She herself ate 3 saucerfuls. Her own private opinion was that it was the very best applesauce ever made. After supper was over and the dishes washed and wiped, Betsy helping with the putting away, the 4 gathered around the big lamp on the table with the red cover. Cousin Ann was making some buttonholes in the shirt waist she had constructed that afternoon. Aunt Abigail was darning socks, and Uncle Henry was mending a piece of harness. Shep lay on the couch and snored until he got so noisy they couldn't stand it, and Cousin Ann poked him in the ribs, and he woke up snorting and gurgling and looking around very sheepishly. Every time this happened, it made Betsy laugh. She held Eleanor, who didn't snore at all, but made the prettiest little tea kettle singing purr deep in her throat, and opened and sheathed her needle-like claws in Betsy's dress. Well, how'd you get on at school? Asked Uncle Henry. I've got your desk, said Elizabeth Ann, looking at him curiously, at his gray hair and wrinkled, weather-beaten face, and trying to think what he must have looked like when he was a little boy like Ralph. So, said Uncle Henry. Well, let me tell you, that's a mighty good desk. Did you notice the deep groove in the top of it? Betsy nodded. She had wondered what that was used for. Well, That was the lead pencil desk in the old days when they couldn't run down to the store to buy things because there wasn't any store to run to. How do you suppose they got their lead pencils? Elizabeth Ann shook her head, incapable even of a guess. She had never thought before but that lead pencils grew in glass showcases and stores. Well, sir, said Uncle Henry, I'll tell you. They took a piece of the lump of lead they made their bullets of, melted it over the fire in the hearth down at the schoolhouse till it would run like water, and poured it in that grove. When it cooled off, there was a long streak of solid lead about as big as one of our lead pencils nowadays. They'd break that up in shorter lengths, and there you'd have your lead pencils, made while you wait. Oh, I tell you, in the old days, folks knew how to take care of themselves more than now. Why weren't they in stores? Asked Elizabeth Ann. She could not imagine living without buying things at stores. Where'd they get the things to put in a store in those days? Asked Uncle Henry argumentatively. Every single thing had to be lugged clear from Albany or from Connecticut on horseback. Why didn't they use wagons? Asked Elizabeth Ann. You can't run a wagon unless you've got a road to run it on, can you? Asked Uncle Henry. It was a long, long time before they had any roads. It's an awful chore to make roads in the new country. All woods and hills and swamps and rocks. You were lucky if there was a good path from your house to the next settlement. Now, Henry, said Aunt Abigail, do stop going on about old times long enough to let Betsy answer the question you asked her. You haven't given her a chance to say how she got on at school. Well, I'm awfully mixed up, said Betsy complainingly. I don't know what I am. I'm second grade arithmetic and third grade spelling and seventh grade reading, and I don't know what in writing or composition. We didn't have those. Nobody seemed to think this very remarkable or even very interesting. Uncle Henry indeed noted it only to say, "Seventh grade reading?" He turned to Aunt Abigail. "Oh, Mother, don't you suppose she could read aloud to us evenings?" Aunt Abigail and Cousin Ann both laid down their sewing to laugh. Yes, Father, and play checkers with you too, like as not," they explained to Betsy. "Your Uncle Henry is just daft on being read aloud to when he's got something to do in the evening, and when he hasn't, he's as fidgety as a broody hen if he can't play checkers. Anne hates checkers, and I haven't got the time often." "Oh, I love to play checkers," said Betsy. "Well, now," said Uncle Henry, rising instantly and dropping his half-mended harness on the table. "Let's have a game." "Oh, Father," said Cousin Ann in the tone she used for Shep. "How about that piece of breeching? You know that's not safe. Why don't you finish that up first?" Uncle Henry sat down again, looking as Shep did when Cousin Ann told him to get up on the couch and took up his needle and awl. "But I could read something aloud," said Betsy, feeling very sorry for him. "At least I think I could. I never did except at school." "What shall we have, Mother?" asked Uncle Henry eagerly. "Oh, I don't know. What have we got in this bookcase?" said Aunt Abigail. "It's pretty cold to go into the parlor to find one." She leaned forward, ran her fat forefinger over the worn old volumes, and took out a battered blue-covered book. "Scott?" "Gosh, yes," said Uncle Henry, his eyes shining. "The Staggered Eve." At least that was the way it sounded to Betsy. But when she took the book and looked where Aunt Abigail pointed, she read it correctly, though in a timid, uncertain voice. She was very proud to think she could please a grown-up so much, as she was evidently pleasing Uncle Henry. But the idea of reading aloud for people to hear, not for a teacher to correct, was unheard of. The stag at eve had drunk his fill, where danced the moon on Monan's rill, she began, and it was as though she had stepped into a boat and was swept off by a strong current. She did not know what all the words meant, and she could not pronounce a good many of the names, but nobody interrupted to correct her, and she read on, steadied by the strongly marked rhythm, drawn forward swiftly from one clanging, sonorous rhyme to another. Uncle Henry nodded his head in time to the rise and fall of her voice, and now and then stopped his work to look at her with bright, eager old eyes. He knew some of the places by heart evidently, for once in a while his voice would join the little girls for a couplet or two. They chanted together thus: "A moment listened to the cry that thickened as the chase drew nigh. Then, as the headmost foes appeared, with one brave brown, the copse he cleared." At the last line, Uncle Henry flung his arm out wide, and the child felt as though the deer had made his great leap there before her eyes. "I've seen him jump just like that," broke in Uncle Henry. "A 200-300-pound stag go up over a 4-foot fence just like a piece of thistledown in the wind." "Uncle Henry," asked Elizabeth Ann, "what is a copse?" "I don't know," said Uncle Henry indifferently. "Something in the woods must be. Underbrush, most likely. You can always tell words you don't know by the sense of the whole thing. Go on."
Copse.
Copse, a small group of trees. Copse, thicket. A stretching forward, free and far, the child's voice took up the chant again. She read faster and faster as it got more exciting. Uncle Henry joined in on. "For jaded now and spent with toil, embossed with foam and dark with soil, while every gasp with sobs he drew, the laboring stag strained full in view." The little girl's heart beat fast. She fled along through the next lines, stumbling desperately over the hard words, but seeing the headlong chase through them clearly as through tree trunks in a forest. Uncle Henry broke in a triumphant shout. "The Willie Quarry shunned the shock and turned him from the opposing rock. Then dashing down a darksome glen, soon lost to hound and hunter's ken. In the deep Trossach's wildest nook, his solitary refuge took." "Oh my," cried Elizabeth Ann, laying down the book. "He got away, didn't he? I was so afraid he wouldn't." "I can just hear those dogs yelping, can't you?" said Uncle Henry. "Yelled on the view the opening pack. Sometimes you hear 'em that way up the slope of Hemlock Mountain back of us when they get to running a deer." "What say we have some popcorn?" suggested Aunt Abigail. "Betsy, don't you want to pop us some?" "I never did," said the little girl, but in a less doubtful tone than she had ever used with that phrase so familiar to her. A dim notion was growing up in her mind that the fact that she had never done a thing was no proof that she couldn't. "I'll show you," said Uncle Henry. He reached down a couple of ears from a big yellow cluster hanging on the wall, and he and Betsy shelled them into the popper, popped it fully of snowy kernels, buttered it, salted it, and took it back to the table. It was just as she was eating her first ambrosial mouthful that the door opened and a fur-capped head was thrust in. A man's voice said, "Evening, folks. No, I can't stay. I was down at the village just now and thought I'd ask for any mail down our way." He tossed the newspaper and a letter on the table and was gone. The letter was addressed to Elizabeth Ann, and it was from Aunt Frances. She read it to herself while Uncle Henry read the newspaper. Aunt Frances wrote that she had been perfectly horrified to learn that Cousin Molly had not kept Elizabeth Ann with her, and that she would never forgive her for that cruelty. And when she thought that her darling was at Putney Farm, her blood ran cold. It positively did. It was too dreadful, but it couldn't be helped, for a time anyhow, because Aunt Harriet was really very sick. Elizabeth Ann would have to be a dear, brave child and endure it as best she could, and as soon as ever she could. Aunt Frances would come and take her away from them. "Don't cry too much, darling. It breaks my heart to think of you there. Try to be cheerful, dearest. Try to bear it for the sake of your distracted, loving Aunt Frances." Elizabeth Ann looked up from this letter and across the table at Aunt Abigail's rosy, wrinkled old face. Bent over her darning, Uncle Henry laid the paper down, took a big mouthful of popcorn, and beat time silently with his hand. When he could speak, he murmured, "100 dogs bayed deep and strong, clattered on 100 steeds along." Old Shep woke up with a snort, and Aunt Abigail fed him a handful of popcorn. Little Eleanor stirred in her sleep, stretched, yawned, and nestled down into a ball again on the little girl's lap. Betsy could feel in her own body the rhythmic vibration of the kitten's contented purr. Aunt Abigail looked up. "Finished your letter? I hope Harriet is no worse. What does Frances say?" Elizabeth Ann blushed a deep red and crushed the letter together in her hand. She felt ashamed, and she did not know why. Aunt Frances says, she began, hesitating. "She says Aunt Harriet is still pretty sick." She stopped, drew a long breath, and went on. "And she sends her love to you." Now, Aunt Frances hadn't done anything of the kind, so this was a really whooping fib. But Elizabeth Ann didn't care if it was. It made her feel less ashamed, though she did not know why. She took another mouthful of popcorn and stroked Eleanor's back. Uncle Henry got up and stretched. "It's time to go to bed, folks," he said. As he wound the clock, Betsy heard him humming. Betsy heard him murmuring, But when the sun his beacon read." Chapter 7. Elizabeth Ann fails in an exam. I wonder if you can guess the name of a little girl who, about a month after this, was walking along through the melting snow in the woods with a big black dog running circles around her. Yes, all alone in the woods with a terrible, great dog beside her, and yet not a bit afraid. You don't suppose it could be Elizabeth Ann? Well, whoever she was, she had something on her mind, for she walked more and more slowly, and had only a very absent-minded pat for the dog's head when he thrust it up for a caress. When the wood road led into a clearing in which there was a rough little house of slabs, the child stopped altogether, and looking down, began nervously to draw lines in the snow with her overshoe. You see, something perfectly dreadful had happened in school that day. The superintendent, the all-important, seldom seen superintendent, came to visit the school, and the children were given some examinations so he could see how they were getting on. Now you know what an examination did to Elizabeth Ann. Or haven't I told you yet? Well, if I haven't, it's because words fail me. If there is anything horrid that an examination didn't do to Elizabeth Ann, I have yet to hear of it. It began years ago, before ever she went to school, when she heard Aunt Frances talking about how she had dreaded examinations when she was a child, and how they dried up her mouth and made her ears ring and her head ache and her knees get all weak and her mind a perfect blank, so that she didn't know what 2 and 2 made. Of course, Elizabeth Ann didn't feel all those things right off at her first examination, but by the time she had had several and had rushed to tell Aunt Frances about how awful they were, and the two of them had sympathized with one another and compared symptoms, and then wept about her resultant low marks, why, she not only had all the symptoms Aunt Frances had ever had, but a good many more of her own invention. Well, she had had them all, and had them hard this afternoon, when the superintendent was there. Her mouth had gone dry, and her knees had shaken, and her elbows had felt as though they had no more bones in them than so much jelly, and her eyes had smarted, and oh, what answers she had made! That dreadful, tight panic had clutched at her throat whenever the superintendent had looked at her, and she had disgraced herself 10 times over. She went hot and cold to think of it, and felt quite sick with hurt vanity. She who did so well every day and was so much looked up to by her classmates, what must they be thinking of her? To tell the truth, she had been crying as she walked along through the woods, because she was so sorry for herself. Her eyes were all red still, and her throat sore from the big lump in it. And now she would live it all over again, as she told the Putney cousins. For of course they must be told, and she had always told Aunt Frances everything that happened in school. It happened that Aunt Abigail had been taking a nap when she got home from school, and so she had come out to the sap house where Cousin Ann and Uncle Henry were making syrup, to have it over with as soon as possible. She went up to the little slab house now, dragging her feet and hanging her head, and opened the door. Cousin Ann, in a very short old skirt and a man's coat and high rubber boots, was just poking some more wood into the big fire, which blazed furiously under the broad, flat pan where the sap was boiling. The rough, brown hut was filled with white steam, and that sweetest of all odors, hot maple syrup. Cousin Ann turned her head, her face very red with the heat of the fire, and nodded at the child. "Hello, Betsy. You're just in time. I've saved out a cup full of hot syrup for you, all ready to wax." Betsy hardly heard this, although she had been wild about waxed sugar on snow ever since her very first taste of it. "Cousin Ann," she said unhappily, the superintendent visited our school this afternoon." "Did he?" said Cousin Ann, dipping a thermometer into the boiling syrup. Yes, and we had examinations, said Betsy. Did you? Said Cousin Ann, holding the thermometer up to the light and looking at it. And you know how perfectly awful examinations make you feel, said Betsy, very near to tears again. Why, no, said Cousin Ann, salting over syrup tins. They never made me feel awful. I thought they were sort of fun. Fun? Cried Betsy, indignantly, staring through the beginnings of her tears. Why, yes, like taking a dare. Don't you know? Somebody stumps you to jump off the hitching post, and you do it to show 'em. I always used to think examinations were like that. Somebody stumps you to spell pneumonia, and you do it to show 'em. Here's your cup of syrup. You better go right out and wax it while it's hot. Elizabeth Ann automatically took the cup in her hand, but she did not look at it. But supposing you get so scared you can't spell pneumonia or anything else, she said feelingly. That's what happened to me. You know how your mouth gets all dry and your knees? She stopped. Cousin Ann had said she did not know all about those things. Well, anyhow, I got so scared I could hardly stand up, and I made the most awful mistakes, things I know just as well. I spelled doubt without any B and separate with an E. And I said Iowa was bounded on the north by Wisconsin, and Oh, well, said Cousin Ann. It doesn't matter if you really know the right answers, does it? That's the important thing. This was an idea which had never in all her life entered Betsy's brain, and she did not take it in at all now. She only shook her head miserably and went in a doleful tone. And I said 13 and 18 are 22, and I wrote March without any capital M, and I... Look here, Betsy, do you want to tell me all this? Cousin Ann spoke in the quick, ringing voice she had once in a while, which made everybody from old Shep up open his eyes and get his wits about him. Betsy gathered hers and thought hard, and she came to an unexpected conclusion. No, she didn't really want to tell Cousin Ann all about it. Why was she doing it? Because she thought that was the thing to do. Because if you don't really want to, went on Cousin Ann, I don't see that it's doing anybody any good. I guess Hemlock Mountain will stand right there just the same, even if you did forget to put a B in doubt. And your syrup will be too cool to wax right if you don't take it out pretty soon. She turned back to stoke the fire, and Elizabeth Ann, in a daze, found herself walking out of the door. It fell shut after her, and there she was, under the clear, pale blue sky, with the sun just hovering over the rim of Hemlock Mountain. She looked up at the big mountains, all blue and silver with shadows and snow, and wondered what in the world Cousin Ann had meant. Of course, Hemlock Mountain would stand there just the same. But what of it? What did that have to do with her arithmetic, with anything? She had failed in her examination, hadn't she? She found a clean white snowbank under a pine tree, and setting up her cup of syrup down in a safe place, began to pat the snow down hard to make the right bed for the waxing of the syrup. The sun, very hot for the late March day, brought out strongly the tarry perfume of the big pine tree. Near her, the sap dripped musically into a bucket, already half full, hung on a maple tree. A blue jay rushed suddenly through the upper branches of the wood. His screaming and chattering voice sounded like noisy children at play. Elizabeth Ann took up her cup and poured some of the thick, hot syrup out on the hard snow, making loops and curves as she poured. It stiffened and hardened at once, and she lifted up a great coil of it, threw her head back, and let it drop into her mouth. Concentrated sweetness of summer days was in that mouthful, part of it still hot and aromatic, part of it icy and wet with melting snow. She crunched it all together with her strong child's teeth into a delicious big lump and sucked on it dreamily. Her eyes on the rim of Hemlock Mountain, high above her there, the snow on it bright golden in the sunlight. Uncle Henry had promised to take her up to the top as soon as the snow went off. She wondered what the top of a mountain would look like. Uncle Henry had said the main thing was that you could see so much of the world at once. He said it was too queer the way your own house and big barn and great fields looked like little toy things that weren't of any account. It was because you could see so much more than just the... She heard an imploring whine, and a cold nose was thrust into her hand. Why, there was old Shep, begging for his share of wax sugar. He loved it, though it did stick to his teeth so. She poured out another lot and gave half of it to Shep. It immediately stuck his jaws together tight, and he began pawing at his mouth and shaking his head till Betsy had to laugh. Then he managed to pull his jaws apart and chewed loudly and visibly, tossing his head, opening his mouth wide till Betsy could see the sticky brown candy draped and melting festoons all over his big white teeth and red gullet. Then with a gulp, he had swallowed it all down and was whining for more, striking softly at the little girl's skirt with his forepaw. "Oh, you eat it too fast," cried Betsy, but she shared her next lot with him too. The sun had gone down over Hemlock Mountain by this time, and the big slope above her was all deep blue shadow. The mountain looked much higher now as the dusk began to fall, and loomed up bigger and bigger as though it reached to the sky. It was no wonder houses looked small from its top. Betsy ate the last of her sugar, looking up at the quiet giant there, towering grandly above her. There was no lump in her throat now, and although she still thought she did not know what in the world Cousin Ann meant by saying that about Hemlock Mountain and her examination, it's my opinion that she had made a very good beginning of an understanding. She was just picking up her cup to take it back to the sap house when Shep growled a little and stood with his ears and tail up, looking down the road. Something was coming down that road in the blue, clear twilight, something that was making a very queer noise. It sounded almost like somebody crying. It was somebody crying. It was a child crying. It was a little girl. Betsy could see her now, stumbling along and crying as though her heart would break. Why, it was little Molly, her own particular charge at school, whose reading lesson she heard every day. Betsy and Shep ran to meet her. "What's the matter, Molly? What's the matter?" Betsy knelt down and put her arms around the weeping child. "Did you fall down? Did you hurt you? What are you doing way off here? Did you lose your way?" "I don't want to go away. I don't want to go away," said Molly over and over, clinging tightly to Betsy. It was a long time before Betsy could quiet her enough to find out what had happened. Then she made out between Molly's sobs that her mother had been taken suddenly sick and had to go away to a hospital, and that left nobody at home to take care of Molly, and she was to be sent away to some strange relatives in the city who didn't want her at all and who said so right out. Oh, Elizabeth Ann knew all about that, and her heart swelled big with sympathy. For a moment she stood again out on the sidewalk in front of the Lathrop house, with old Mrs. Lathrop's ungracious white head bobbing from a window, and knew again that ghastly feeling of being unwanted. Oh, she knew why little Molly was crying, and she shut her hands together hard and made up her mind that she would help her out. Do you know what she did right off without thinking about it? She didn't go and look up Aunt Abigail. She didn't wait till Uncle Henry came back from his round of emptying sap buckets into the big tub on his sled. As fast as her feet could carry her, she flew back to Cousin Ann in the sap house. I can't tell you, except again that Cousin Ann was Cousin Ann, why it was that Betsy ran so fast to her and was so sure that everything would be all right as soon as Cousin Ann knew about it. But whatever the reason was, it was a good one. It was a good one. For though Cousin Ann did not stop to kiss Molly or even to look at her more than one sharp first glance, she said after a moment's pause, during which she filled a syrup can and screwed the cover down very tight, "Well, if her folks will let us stay, how would you like to have Molly come and stay with us till her mother gets back from the hospital? Now you've got a room of your own, I guess you wanted to. You could have her sleep with you." "Oh, Molly, Molly, Molly!" shouted Betsy, jumping up and down and then hugging the little girl with all her might. "Oh, it will be like having a little sister." Cousin Ann sounded a dry, warning note. "Don't be too sure her folks will let her. We don't know about them yet." Betsy ran to her and caught her hand, looking up at her with shining eyes. "Cousin Ann, if you go to see them and ask them, they will." This made even Cousin Ann give a little abashed smile of pleasure, although she made her face grave again at once and said, "You'd better go along back to the house now, Betsy. It's time for you to help Mother with the supper." The two children trotted back along the darkening wood road, Shep running before them, little Molly clinging fast to the older child's hand. "Aren't you ever afraid, Betsy, in the woods this way?" she asked admiringly, looking about her with timid eyes. "Oh, no," said Betsy protectingly. "There's nothing to be afraid of except getting off on the wrong fork of the road near the wolf pit." "Oh, ow," said Molly, scringing. "What's the wolf pit? What an awful name." Betsy laughed. She tried to make her laugh sound brave like Cousin Ann's, which always seemed so scornful of being afraid. As a matter of fact, she was beginning to fear that they had made the wrong turn, and she was not quite sure that she could find the way home. But she put this out of her mind and walked along very fast, peering ahead into the dusk. "Oh, it hasn't anything to do with wolves," she said in answer to Molly's question. "Anyhow, not now. It's just a big, deep hole in the ground where a brook had dug out a cave. Uncle Henry told me all about it when he showed it to me, and then part of the roof caved in. Sometimes there's ice in the corner of the covered pot all summer, Aunt Abigail says." "Why do you call it the wolf pit?" asked Molly, walking very close to Betsy and holding very tightly to her hand. "Oh, ever so long ago, when the first settlers came up here, they heard a wolf howling all night, and when it didn't stop in the morning, they came up here on the mountain and found a wolf had fallen in and couldn't get out." "My, I hope they killed him," said Molly. "Oh, gracious, that was more than 100 years ago," said Betsy. She was not thinking of what she was saying. She was thinking that if they were on the right road, they ought to be home by this time. She was thinking that the right road ran downhill to the house all the way, and that this certainly seemed to be going up a little. She was wondering what had become of Shep. Stand here just a minute, Molly, she said. I just want to go ahead a little bit and see. She darted on around a curve of the road and stood still, her heart sinking. The road turned there and led straight up the mountain. For just a moment, the little girl felt a wild impulse to burst out in a shriek for Aunt Frances, and to run crazily away, anywhere so long as she was running. But the thought of Molly standing back there, trustfully waiting to be taken care of, shut Betsy's lips together hard before her scream of fright got out. She stood still, thinking, now she mustn't get afraid. Now she mustn't get frightened. And all they had to do was to walk back along the road till they came to the fork, and then make the right turn. But what if they didn't get back to the turn till it was so dark they couldn't see it? Well, she mustn't think of that. She ran back calling, "Come on, Molly," in a tone she tried to make as firm as Cousin Anne's. "I guess we have made the wrong turn after all. We'd better." But there was no Molly there. In the brief moment Betsy had stood thinking, Molly had disappeared. The long, shadowy wood road held not a trace of her. Then Betsy was frightened, and then she did begin to scream at the top of her voice. "Molly! Molly!" She was beside herself with terror, and started back hastily to hear Molly's voice, very faint, apparently coming from the ground under her feet. "Ow! Ow, Betsy! Get me out! Get me out! Where are you?" shrieked Betsy. "I don't know," came Molly's sobbing voice. "I just moved the least bit out of the road and slipped on the ice and began to slide, and I couldn't stop myself, and I fell down into a deep hole." Betsy's head felt as though her hair was standing up straight on end with horror. Molly must have fallen down into the wolf pit. Yes, they were quite near it. She remembered now. That big white birch tree stood right at the place where the brook tumbled over the edge and fell into it. Although she was dreadfully afraid of falling in herself, she went cautiously over to this tree, feeling her way with her foot to make sure she did not slip, and peered down into the cavernous gloom below. Yes, there was Molly's little face, just a white speck. The child was crying, sobbing, and holding up her arms to Betsy. "Are you hurt, Molly?" "No, I fell into a big snowbank, but I'm all wet and frozen, and I want to get out. I want to get out." Betsy held on to the birch tree. Her head whirled. What should she do? "Look here, Molly," she called down. "I'm going to run back along to the right road and back to the house and get Uncle Henry. He'll come with a rope and get you out." At this time, Molly's crying rose to a frantic scream. "Oh, Betsy, don't leave me down here alone. Don't. The wolves will get me, Betsy. Don't leave me alone." The child was wild with terror. "But I can't get you out myself," screamed back Betsy, crying herself. Her teeth were chattering with the cold. "Don't go! Don't go!" came up from the darkness of the pit in a piteous howl. Betsy made a great effort and stopped crying. She sat down on a stone and tried to think. And this is what came into her mind as a guide. What would Cousin Anne do if she were here? She wouldn't cry. She would think of something. Betsy looked around her desperately. The first thing she saw was the big limb of a pine tree broken off by the wind, which half lay and half slantingly stood up against the tree a little distance above the mouth of the pit. It had been there so long that the needles had all dried and fallen off, and the skeleton of the branch with the broken stubs looked like, yes, it looked like a ladder. That was what Cousin Ann would have done. Wait a minute, Molly, she called wildly down the pit, warm all over in excitement. Now listen, you go off there in the corner, where the ground makes a sort of roof. I'm going to throw down something you can climb up on, maybe. Ow, it'll hit me, cried poor little Molly, more and more frightened, but she scrambled off under her shelter obediently, while Betsy struggled with the branches. It was so firmly embedded in the snow that at first she could not budge it at all. But after she cleared that away and pried hard with the stick she was using as a lever, she felt it give a little. She bore down with all her might, throwing her weight again and again on her lever, and finally felt the big branch perceptibly move. After that it was easier, as its course was downhill over the snow to the mouth of the pit. Glowing and pushing, wet with perspiration, she slowly maneuvered it along to the edge, turned it squarely, gave it a great shove, and leaned over anxiously. Then she gave a great sigh of relief. Just as she had hoped, it went down sharp end first and stuck fast in the snow, which had saved Molly from broken bones. She was so out of breath with her work that for a moment she could not speak. Then, Molly, there! Now I guess you can climb up to where I can reach you. Molly made a rush for any way out of her prison and climbed like the little practiced squirrel that she was, up from one stub to another to the top of the branch. She was still below the edge of the pit there, but Betsy lay flat down on the snow and held out her hands. Molly took hold hard and, digging her toes into the snow, slowly wormed her way up to the surface of the ground. It was then, at that very moment, that Shep came bounding up to them, barking loudly, and after him Cousin Ann, striding along in her rubber boots with a lantern in her hand and a rather anxious look on her face. She stopped short and looked at the two little girls covered with snow, their faces flaming with excitement, and at the black hole gaping behind them. I always told Father we ought to put a fence around that pit, she said in a matter-of-fact voice. Someday a sheep's going to fall down there. Shep came along to the house without you, and we thought most likely you'd taken the wrong turn. Betsy felt terribly aggrieved. She wanted to be petted and praised for her heroism. She wanted Cousin Ann to realize. Oh, if Aunt Frances were only there, she would realize. I fell down in the hole, and Betsy wanted to go and get Mr. Putney, but I wouldn't let her, and so she threw down a big branch and I climbed out, exclaimed Molly, who, now that her danger was past, took Betsy's action quite as a matter of course. Oh, that was how it happened, said Cousin Ann. She looked down the hole and saw the big branch and looked back and saw the long trail of crushed snow where Betsy had dragged it. Well now, that was quite a good idea for a little girl to have, she said briefly. I guess you'll do to take care of Molly all right. She spoke in her usual voice and immediately drew the children after her, but Betsy's heart was singing joyfully as she trotted along, clasping Cousin Ann's strong hand. Now she knew that Cousin Ann realized. She trotted fast, smiling to herself in the darkness. What made you think of doing that? Asked Cousin Ann presently, as they approached the house. Why, I tried to think what you would have done if you'd been there, said Betsy. Oh, said Cousin Ann. Well. She didn't say another word, but Betsy, glancing up into her face as they stepped into the lighted room, saw an expression that made her give a little skip and hop of joy. She had pleased Cousin Ann. That night, as she lay in her bed, her arm over Molly, cuddled up warm beside her, she remembered, oh, ever so faintly, as something of no importance, that she had failed in an examination that afternoon.